The autumn fog lay thick upon the rolling hills of northern France, a pale veil through which the ruined world emerged only in fragments, splintered trees, broken earth, and the bent skeletons of barbed wire glistening with dew. Private Edward Hall, of the King's Own Regiment, crouched low in the trench and tried not to think of England. He had learned that thoughts of home could hurt more than shrapnel. The war had dragged on for 3 years, and yet each day felt like the first. Mud beneath the boots, cold in the lungs, fear at the back of the throat. The sergeants barked orders, the artillery thundered, and men, boys, many of them, went forward into that unrelenting gray, only to vanish into silence. Edward had once been a clerk in London, a quiet young man with ink-stained fingers. He had loved books, long walks by the Thames, and evenings in his small flat with the sound of rain on the windows. When the war came, he had enlisted not out of patriotism, but because everyone else had. To remain behind felt dishonorable. Now, at 24, he had seen enough death to know honor was a fragile currency, spent too easily by those who never stood in the mud. On the morning of the assault at Somber Hill, Edward sat writing a letter. His handwriting trembled as he wrote to his sister, Alice. "Do not worry if I cannot write again. The world here is unlike anything one could imagine, mud that swallows men whole, air that reeks of iron and smoke. Yet amidst all this, I think of home, of you, of the sound of bells from St. John's when the streets are quiet. If I do not return, promise me you will remember me not as a soldier, but simply as your brother, who loved the little things of life." He sealed the paper just as the whistle blew. The charge began. Men clambered from the trench, rifles clutched, bayonets fixed. Edward followed, though his legs felt hollow beneath him. The air filled with the crack of machine guns, the roar of shells bursting above. Earth flew upward in showers of soil and stone. Men screamed. Edward pressed forward, eyes half shut, stumbling more than running. Ahead lay Somber Hill, a mound scarred by endless bombardment, its slope bare of trees, littered with helmets, boots, and broken bodies. The Germans held the crest with ruthless fire. Every few yards another comrade fell. Yet still the King's Own advanced, as though some grim hand pushed them onwards. Edward threw himself into a crater, heart hammering. Beside him lay a boy no older than 17, gasping, blood pouring from his chest. Edward pressed a hand to the wound, but the boy's eyes glazed. He whispered for his mother, then was gone. Edward felt a coldness settle in him, deeper than fear. Hours passed in chaos. Waves of men rose and were cut down. The hills seemed to devour them. Edward fired when he could, reloaded with trembling hands, and crawled forward inch by inch. By dusk, the King's Own held a shallow line halfway up the slope. The price had been hundreds of lives. Night fell, but the guns never ceased. Edward lay in the mud, unable to sleep, staring at the dark shape of the hill against the faint stars. He thought of London again, the sound of horses' hooves on wet cobbles, the yellow glow of gas lamps. He wondered if anyone back home could truly grasp what was happening here, where earth itself seemed alive with groans and whispers of the dead. At dawn, the attack resumed. This time Edward felt a strange detachment, as though his body moved without him. He no longer thought of survival, only of finishing what had begun. Perhaps it was the only way to silence the endless thunder in his head. The regiment pushed higher, shouting, bayonets gleaming. The hilltop loomed near. Edward's ears rang with explosions. Smoke stung his eyes. Then he saw Sergeant McBride fall, struck by a shell fragment, his body crumpling like a puppet with cut strings. Edward wanted to stop, but the momentum of men around him carried him forward. At last, through fire and ruin, they reached the crest. A brutal melee followed, steel against steel, faces grimy and bloodied. The Germans fought desperately, but slowly they were forced back. When the sun set that evening, the Union Jack fluttered above Somber Hill, though scarcely a third of the regiment remained standing. Edward stood there, breathing hard, his rifle heavy with blood and mud. Around him lay the silent proof of victory, friends, enemies, all reduced to stillness. He felt no triumph, only emptiness. The hill had been taken, but at what cost? The world seemed smaller, darker. That night, the sky above Somber Hill was blackened not only by the smoke of battle, but by the weight of silence that followed it. The air, still thick with the acrid stench of powder, hung like a suffocating curtain over the bodies scattered upon the slope. Every so often, a distant gun would crack like thunder rolling through the heavens, but compared to the ferocity of the day, the battlefield seemed strangely hushed, as if even the war itself had grown weary of its own cruelty. Private Edward Hall sat hunched in the mud of a shallow dugout, a small flicker of candlelight trembling before him. His uniform clung damply to his skin, stiff with dried blood and filth, and his hands, cold, raw, and trembling, struggled to keep steady over the paper that rested on his knee. He had meant to sleep, but sleep had long since abandoned men like him. Instead, he turned once more to his ritual of writing, the only act that tethered him to the world beyond this pit of ruin. The pencil scratched slowly, faltering with every word. "Alice, if this reaches you, know that I have seen a place where heaven and hell meet upon the earth." He paused, staring at the line until the candle guttered. He thought of his sister's face, the way her laughter had once filled their small home in London, the way her hand had brushed against his arm as she begged him not to go to war. He had smiled then, assuring her it would be brief, that he would return with medals and stories. How childish those promises seemed now. The pencil trembled onward. "I cannot explain it. Only that when men fall here, they do not fall alone, but with all of history pressing down upon them." He stopped again, lifting his gaze to the dark sky. He wondered if all those who had fallen before him, on other fields, in other centuries, were somehow here too, mingled with the smoke, whispering through the soil. The battlefield seemed haunted, not only by the dead of today, but by all who had ever died in war. Every mound of earth, every shattered tree carried a memory not his own. His hand shook worse now, the pencil smudging. "I wish to live, yet if I do not, remember me as I was before all this, the Edward who laughed, who dreamed, who believed in gentle things." His throat tightened at the thought. He remembered his books, the quiet lamplight of his room, the faint smell of ink and paper. He remembered summer walks along the Thames, the way the river had caught the glow of the setting sun. All of it seemed impossibly distant, as though it belonged not to his life, but to another man entirely. He set the pencil down for a moment and buried his face in his hands. Around him the night stretched endless and heavy. Somewhere nearby, a wounded man groaned, calling faintly for water, but no one stirred. The living were too few, too broken, and too afraid. Edward wished he could rise and go to the man, but his own strength was nearly gone. He had nothing left but words, and even those slipped from him like sand through fingers. He picked the pencil up again, forcing himself to fold the page carefully. He did not seal it, for sealing it felt too final, too much like surrender. He told himself he would finish it in the morning, when his hands no longer shook, when his mind felt clear. For now, he slid the folded sheet into his breast pocket, close to his heart, as though its presence might shield him against whatever awaited at dawn. But dawn never came for Edward Hall. Before the first gray light could edge across the horizon, a bombardment began. The Germans, unwilling to surrender Somber Hill, unleashed their vengeance in a storm of shells. The earth shook, the sky split, and the hill was swallowed once more in fire and smoke. Edward barely had time to register the first scream of incoming artillery before the world collapsed around him. When the smoke cleared, the crest of Somber Hill lay littered with the broken remains of those who had held it through the night. Among them lay Edward, his body still, his unfinished letter pressed against his chest. The paper was marked with soil and blood, its words blurred yet still legible, the fragile testament of a young man who had once believed in gentle things. Weeks later, long after the guns had moved on to another place, the fallen were gathered, their possessions collected for delivery to grieving families back home. A weary officer, sorting through pockets, came upon Edward's folded letter. He hesitated as he read the words, struck by the quiet humanity of them amidst such devastation. He placed the letter carefully in a packet, addressed it to Miss Alice Hall, London, and sent it across the sea. When Alice opened it, sitting alone by the window of her small house, the city around her hummed with ordinary life, markets opening, bells ringing, carriages rattling across the cobbles. She read her brother's final words with trembling hands. She pressed the paper to her lips and closed her eyes. The world outside might never know Edward Hall, might never speak his name, but to her, he was not a soldier, not merely a casualty of war. He was her brother, the boy who had laughed, who had dreamed, who had believed in gentle things. And in that letter, though unfinished, Edward lived on. Weeks later, in a quiet house along a cobbled London street, a small brown parcel arrived at the door. The postman delivered it without ceremony, tipping his cap before moving on. To him, it was only another package, one among many that had come from the war. But to Alice Hall, who carried it carefully into her parlor, it felt unbearably heavy, as though the weight of the whole world had been placed into her hands. She set it upon the table and, for a long time, did not open it. The brown paper was smeared faintly with mud, the string tied tightly, as if someone had taken care to protect what lay within. Alice stared at it in silence, her heart pounding, her mind unwilling to accept what she already knew, that her brother Edward would not return. The telegram had told her as much, in words so brief they felt almost cruel. Yet this parcel was different. It was personal, intimate, something that had belonged to him alone. At last, with trembling fingers, she untied the string and peeled away the wrapping. Inside lay his diary, the cover warped with damp, its pages stained with mud and touched by the roughness of war. Tucked beside it were 2 folded letters, one sealed, the other unfinished. She lifted them as though they were fragile relics, capable of crumbling in her hands. Alice lit the lamp upon the table, its soft glow pushing back the gray of evening. She sat down and began to read. The words swam before her eyes, blurred not by the poor handwriting but by the tears that fell silently onto the page. In the diary she read of long nights in the trenches, of comrades who had become brothers, and of the silence that followed their sudden loss. She read of rain that seemed never to end, of the mud that swallowed men, of the distant memories of London that had kept him alive. Then she turned to the letters. The first was addressed to her, written with a steadier hand. It spoke of hope, of longing to see home again, of how he remembered the bells of St. John's and the quiet evenings they had once shared. The second letter, unfinished, struck her more deeply still. In its fragile lines Edward wrote of heaven and hell meeting upon the earth, of men who fell not alone but with the weight of history pressing upon them. He had asked her to remember him not as a soldier, but as her brother, the Edward who had laughed, who had dreamed, who had believed in gentle things. Alice pressed the pages to her chest and wept. Outside her window, the city carried on as though nothing had changed. Carriages rattled over the wet stones, vendors called their wares in the street, children played and shouted. The world moved forward, indifferent to the fact that yet another life had been extinguished far away on a nameless hill in France. But for Alice, time did not move in the same way. From that evening onward, she kept the diary and the 2 letters wrapped carefully in a length of ribbon, folded neatly in the drawer of her writing desk. She did not speak of them often, but she returned to them when the world felt too loud, too careless, too quick to forget. On such nights, she would untie the ribbon, unfold the pages, and read them slowly by lamplight. And in those moments, Edward Hall was with her again, not as a casualty of war, not as a name inscribed on a memorial, but as her brother, a quiet dreamer who had once believed in gentle things. His words, written in the mud and smoke of a trench across the sea, continued to speak softly through the silence of history, carrying his memory forward long after his voice was gone.